there's a reasonable chance that he simply answered the door, not thinking that there could be any chance in this world that it could be the burglar returning because he had left something.
Where you live is your safest possible place in which to repel an attack.
There's just no predicting what criminals will do.
This is the In Self-Defense Podcast with Don West, Steve Moses, and Shawn Vincent, exploring high-profile self-defense cases and identifying the lessons learned for concealed carriers.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. I am Shawn Vincent. This is the In Self-Defense Podcast, hosted by CCW Safe. I'm glad you're here. Often on this show, we talk about stories of armed defenders that make some mistakes, that challenge their self-defense claim. Today, we're going to have a home intrusion case of a burglar who had struck a home while the tenant was not home, left some valuables there, if you believe that, and then came back later to retrieve those valuables only to find the homeowner had returned and was willing to defend himself. A fight broke out. It ended up with the occupant of the apartment shooting and killing the intruder who had come armed and ready to fight. This is a case, it brings up, first of all, a conversation about the protections of the Castle Doctrine and how there is no place where you're more legally sound to use deadly force in defense of yourself or your family. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what, as an armed defender, your responsibilities will be to secure your home after a burglary attempt, to make sure that you're not just relying on your firearm as your first and only line of defense. It's about securing that door and taking extra precautions to protect yourself, because as Steve Moses tells us, you'll be at a heightened risk of additional crime after an initial burglary. I am joined today by Steve Moses. He's a well-regarded firearms instructor and CCW Safe contributor. Also, as always, my friend Don West. He is National Trial Counsel for CCW Safe and a veteran criminal defense attorney. As always, our conversation today is not specific legal advice, nor is it specific tactical advice. What we do on the show is we look at high-profile self-defense cases. We have an informed discussion, and we try to draw lessons for armed defenders and concealed carriers, so that you guys can make smarter decisions if you ever find yourself in a self-defense scenario. That said, here's my conversation about the foolish burglars with Don West and Steve Moses.
You know, I'm from the Great Lakes area. My wife is from Wisconsin, and we had a high-profile case that we talked about a few years ago from Kenosha, which is the proper way to say it, Kenosha. And today we're going to talk about this case where, you know, we talk a lot on this show about armed defenders that made some mistakes that may have scuttled their self-defense claims, or at least caused them a challenge that led them to face prosecution. Every once in a while, I like to look at an example of a justifiable use of force that's hard to poke any holes in, hard to argue with, something that resulted in no charges, not even an arrest or being taken into custody from what it looks like. And this is the case where a couple of young burglars went to this apartment complex in Kenosha, broke in, stole some things from this guy's apartment, including a firearm, what I read from the report, left, and then sometime later one of the intruders discovered he had left something of his back at the apartment. So decided he'd go break in again, or maybe he'd already done the breaking, so he just had to enter in to get his stuff back. And he was somehow surprised to discover that the occupant of that apartment had returned. We don't have a lot of details, but a fight ensued, and then at one point the intruder is shot. I'm not sure if the intruder was shot with his own gun or shot with the tenant's gun that he had stolen and maybe brought back to the scene of the crime. Or try this on for size, Steve. I've found that if somebody owns one firearm, there's a really good chance they own two or more firearms.
That could be true of me.
Yeah,
There you go.
exactly.
Uh-huh.
It's like guitars. I find that if someone owns one guitar, they've probably got at least two or three other ones stashed around the house, in the den, and the so anyway, so this is one of the few cases where I've seen that somebody had burglarized a home and then actually left things of value behind, which I thought was great. So foolish burglar, but not a surprise that this homeowner wasn't charged or arrested with anything.
Yeah, the where you live is your safest possible place in which to repel an attack. It's the highly defensible property that Andrew Branca talks about. And in many states, of course, there's in fact a presumption that if someone forcibly, without consent, enters your home, that you are presumed to be in reasonable fear of great bodily harm or death, which takes that element right off the table. So someone breaks into your house, you see that person, you at that point in time are, absent some extraordinary circumstances, are justified to use lethal force in order to repel this intruder. So that's sort of the starting point. And in this instance, we have some added circumstances. There's no indication that he knew this person or it was a mistake somehow. It was 4:30 in the morning. This guy comes back with his own agenda to retrieve whatever it was that he left there the last time. And it seems clear from the limited media that there was actually a physical confrontation, a fight of some sort, and then ultimately the tenant shot and killed this burglar. So a couple of things to keep in mind. We're talking in a sense about Castle Doctrine. Castle Doctrine, regardless of whether your state may have a duty to retreat, generally you don't in your home. So that's part of the notion of the Castle Doctrine. Another part of it is when the state legislature passes these laws that create these presumptions in favor of the homeowner using force to defend their property. And then, of course, it doesn't matter whether you own the home or rent the home, are temporarily staying in the home, or it's your RV and you're a campground. If it's where you are living, you have the protection of the Castle Doctrine and the rights and privileges that go along with it.
So kind of like wherever your bed is, if you're sleeping there tonight,
or couch,
or couch, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I want to talk to you about this. One of the questions I have that we were not going to be able to answer with this article, but it's worth a discussion because we don't know from the news reporting. But it seems like this guy got back into the apartment when the homeowner was there. And so I'm wondering some thoughts from you, maybe twofold. If you were to come home late at night and found that your house had been burglarized, what are you going to do to secure your home to make sure someone can't come back in? And from your experience in law enforcement, how likely or unlikely is it that someone would return to the scene of a crime like that?
Well, in reference to the first question, especially living in an apartment complex, I would want to get in touch with the landlord and get them in there to change those locks immediately. In terms of perhaps how he got in there, there's a reasonable chance that he simply answered the door not thinking that there could be any chance in this world that it could be the burglar returning because he had left something.
Sure, this is the last place that person would
I
want to be.
believe so. I believe he was probably quite surprised. One of the things, though, it also kind of drove home to me was just a reminder that in many instances, burglars will return to a home that they burgled a month, 2 months afterwards, because they know that more than likely the victim has replaced many of those same items. And actually had a family member that happened exactly to them. They replaced a number of items, I think, including a big screen TV and perhaps even some firearms. And they were broken into again, probably about 2 months after the initial crime.
Some of those things that you said made me think of two cases that we've talked about on this show in the past. One was, I believe it was Zach Peters. That was the kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was at home. He was napping in the midday, heard shattered glass, three bandits in black armed with, impact weapons were there. And they had burglarized and broken into the guest house of this property sometime before that. Then they decided to come back during the day when they thought no one was home to get what they could from the real house, and were surprised that somebody was there. And it also makes me think of the Charles Dorsey case. And here's why. Because Charles didn't know it at the time, but his neighbor's house guest was heavily intoxicated and confused which house was his and which house was his neighbor's in the dark, and had tried to get in thinking that it was where he was a guest, and kind of wandered off and came back. The Dorseys called the police, and they actually unlocked the deadbolt on their front door, just thinking that the police would arrive anytime and, I don't know, make it easier for them to open it up. But because that deadbolt wasn't locked when the confused house guest came back and really gave it his all with that door, he broke the latch and the door came open. And we talked, if he had just secured that deadbolt, then the guy never would have gotten in.
Or he would have had a greater, more difficulty in doing so.
Much more difficult time getting in, especially if he did it like some of our guests suggest, with the right nails and the right materials
metal
for the
door, metal jam, metal threshold.
And I had a self-defense case one time where the homeowner actually had a confrontation on his front yard with a neighbor that turned violent. And one of the things that we tried to work up at trial was that one of the reasons he didn't just go inside his house is because his house the day before had been broken into, and he couldn't secure the front door. He couldn't go lock himself in there. And so I guess if I'm a homeowner or a tenant in an apartment and I've been burglarized, would you stay there if you had any other options, if you couldn't actually secure the property after that, Steve?
No. If I did not have any other options. But in many instances, probably in that apartment, they probably could have gotten that threshold. They probably could have gotten that repaired very quickly. That's definitely not necessarily the case for, the average homeowner. If I had something like that happen to my home out here in rural Texas, it might be a couple of days before I could get someone out here to repair that door jam and that door lock.
Well, both of those cases remind me of a couple of things. First, since we're talking about Charles Dorsey and the fact that the drunk neighbor's guest was able to, by jiggling the door, either break or loosen the latch enough that the door opened, and that's what resulted in him being shot to death. A deadbolt would have prevented him from being opening the door, and there's no reason whatsoever to think that he would have put his shoulder to it and tried to smash his way into the house, because he wasn't trying to do a home invasion. He thought he was at his home and he just needed to get someone's attention to let him in. So that would have ended that case, and that guy would
tragedy would have been avoided.
And not that Charles Dorsey was charged. It took a few days before he could be clear, but he now is living with all of that, of course, for the rest of his life. The fact that as you think about things you could have done, would have done, should have done stuff, he's certainly having to deal with that.
Yeah.
On the Zach Peters case, as I remember that case, there was a young woman, maybe even a teenager, who was out in the car during the burglary. She was ostensibly the getaway driver. And when Zach Peters shot and killed one of the burglars, it turned out that she was then prosecuted under a felony murder theory because she was an accomplice in this serious burglary. And as a result of this burglary, someone died. And it really doesn't matter at whose hands they die in many places with these felony murder rules. So in this instance, the homeowner shot and killed the burglar, but because someone died during the burglary, the getaway driver was legally on the hook for it. And what made me think about the case we're talking about now in that context is I can't tell from the limited report we have whether dumb or dumber, whichever you want to label these guys, whether the second guy went back to help his friend retrieve the items that were left behind. If he did, and he was present, even if he was outside in the car or certainly around the apartment, but didn't engage directly with the tenant, that doesn't matter. He would be legally responsible under a felony murder rule for some level of criminal homicide. Maybe not first degree murder, but second degree maybe, or it depends on how the states look at that. And I have personal experience representing people who have been charged with murder when their accomplice was shot and killed by a police officer. So, I mean, like I said, it really doesn't matter who pulls the trigger in that situation. If someone dies during the commission of some of these enumerated felonies, you can be prosecuted for a degree of murder.
Yeah, I did one once, Don, where the two committed their crime, and then the police had been called. They heard sirens, and then they both run in different directions. And the police only chase one of them, and they end up like 20 minutes in opposite directions, but the one ends up in a shootout. Mm-hmm. Someone gets killed, and the guy in the completely other direction, now 40 minutes away, charged with felony murder. I looked at this case. I had that thought too. Cooper is the last name of the guy who went back for his stuff. Lee was his accomplice in the burglary. Mm-hmm. It says that police found and arrested Lee, who they said was part of the original burglary. Lee is charged with burglary using a dangerous weapon and theft of a firearm. So he may escape the felony murder problem that you described.
He simply may not have gone back.
Yeah, which if nothing else, maybe we can learn something from the foolish burglars here. They left a place of relative safety, Steve, to go back to a place where their risk was higher, and maybe if he still had the gun that he was stolen, he certainly wasn't competent with it because he got his ass kicked by this guy and shot.
There's just no predicting what criminals will do. And I think I may have mentioned this in another podcast we did recently, was that in many instances, they're under the influence, they're drunk, they're thinking, their logic is impaired, and they just do things that just seem to be completely irrational to us, that made perfect sense to them at the time.
Yeah, including committing the burglary to get more money so they can continue to get drunker or get more drugs. So that it's a sort of a continuum here until they run out of things to sell or trade. Sure.
Well, based on our limited information, two lessons I take from this. One is if you do happen to be the victim of a burglary, then you're on a heightened security alert after. And we say about this over and over again in home defense, don't make your firearm your only home security option. Good deadbolts, lighting, alarms, other features are going to prevent you from having to make that life or death choice. And then two is, don't leave a place of safety. This is from the criminal's point of view to put yourself at risk.
It's kind of funny to make that comment, but it's so true in that when you leave a place of safety, you just don't know what's going to happen. And whether you are chasing a burglar or from that side of it, or the point here is even if you are the burglar, you are taking on an enormous amount of risk when you further inject yourself in something like this.
Yeah, and maybe a third is you don't have to open the door to every person who comes around knocking. And I love what you said, Steve, last time we talked about a front door incident, is it's okay to say, who is it?
That's all it takes.
And
That's all it
disambiguate before
takes.
you accidentally let the burglar in who just terrorized your home while you weren't home. If that's indeed what happened here, uh, we're being critically hypothetically completely.
I just wanted to kind of close the circle on some comments I made early on
Yeah,
about
for sure.
Andrew Branca describing the home as the most defensible property and how the law favors the homeowner in virtually every situation. And that's why when you have the presumption that an intruder in your house, the presumption that you are in fear of reasonable fear of great bodily harm or death, that's why so many accidental deaths occur in homes when you shoot a relative that has a key that you don't know about, or someone comes in the back door thinking they're at their home instead of yours, or what have you. And it's just tragedy piled upon tragedy. But nonetheless, the homeowner rarely gets prosecuted, even though they have shot and killed a fairly innocent person, but for the fact that they non-consensually entered the home or showed up in the home in the middle of the night without knowledge of the homeowner. Those are the just the awful things, of course.
And so just because you have the law on your side and you have the presumption and the benefit to presume that whoever's there means you harm, doesn't mean you shouldn't disambiguate and make the effort to make sure that the threat's real before you resort to deadly force, if you can safely do so.
Yeah, that's of course, Steve's the guy to talk us through that. But of course, if you safely can, if you have your wits about you, if you have a plan, if you are prepared and tactically skilled and all of that to be able to, what's your phrase?
Disambiguate.
Disambiguate.
Yeah.
I'm stuck on that one. To clarify might be an easier way.
There you
or
go.
two.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts, Steve?
No, other than indeed, if you've been burgled, and I've told you my story, I was,
Yeah.
and that was pretty traumatic. We basically kind of barricaded the door up, even though we replaced the deadlock. We barricaded the door jamb so you couldn't get in without moving a chair. And then just as soon as we could, which was within probably 45 days, we were out of there. We went someplace else.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, not only was there, just this kind of thing that, oh, they could come back, but there's also this sense of being violated, that someone came in and, every time you come into your home or you hear a noise, you tend to just kind of replay what
Yeah.
took place again. And the best thing to do is just take any means that you can to make sure that doesn't happen in the first place.
All right, everybody, that's the podcast for today. Appreciate you sticking through to the end. Next time, we have an interesting conversation about a man who antagonized and provoked the people that he ultimately claimed attacked him, forcing him to use deadly force. We'll talk about why that's such a challenge to a self-defense claim. Until then, as always, be smart, stay safe, and take care.
Or couch.